Smoke from the kitchen hearth braided with winter air, as Ilyana Mubin pinched dough into braids and kept count with her knuckles. In her rear house, the calendar hung crooked over a cracked tile, declaring a December that had overstayed like an unkind guest. Somewhere in the halls, a silver clock announced each minute with a click that sounded like teeth. New Year's lanterns, paper thin and rumor bright, waited in the pantry like quiet stars. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. She pressed 2 fingers against the counter to steady the tremor in her hand, and listened for the footsteps she had learned to anticipate the way fishermen learn the moods of rivers. Ilyana could tell who was coming by how the floorboards spoke. The thin, quick complaint from Miss Rushni Harir with her needle heels, the lazy heel-to-toe sway of elder son Arif, the efficient, busy slide of Geeta, the housemaid, who could move a mountain of linen and leave the air smelling of boiled starch. She could even hear her own mother's tread in memory, Shamsun, the cook, whose step had once mixed the softness of bread with the sternness of debt. But Shamsun was a memory now, a scar where flesh had been, a ledger line erased, a debt that refused to stop collecting. On the wall above the clay stove, the house's rules were taped on onion skin paper, edges curled from steam. They were not written by a hand that cooked. They were written by a hand that assumed heat belonged to those who never touched flame. The rules had multiplied over years the way rumors breed. No waste of oil, no drying of laundry on the veranda during guests, no cutlery missing from their precise count, no talking back, no leaving the grounds without a signed chit, no daydreaming at the sink. The last one always pricked Ilyana like a thorn. No daydreaming. It was like forbidding the body to breathe. She would pause at the stove, mind racing ahead of ingredients, and think, one day the air will be mine. The idea felt dangerous and clean. Her sister's laughter rippled in from the wash-yard. Minal, quick-witted and watchful, telling a story about the tailor's son. Saria, quieter, answering with a soft gasp at every joke, then letting it dissolve into a hum the pigeons loved. They were the kind of laughter that tried not to call trouble, but could never quite avoid it. The 3 daughters of a cook everyone called Slave, with a half-joke that never had the courage to hide its sharp edge. Shamsun had come to Harir House when she was 13, sold as bonded labor for a sum that was counted out like coins for a funeral. 32 years later, other people's money still lived inside her bones. Cook, Arif's voice slid under the door, as if the wood had learned to open for him. "Where is my tea?" Ilyana poured milky tea into the cup marked with a faint chip at the lip, the cup he insisted on using, as if the chip made it his signature. She carried it into the hall, steps measured, eyes low. The rules did not say to keep eyes low, but the house did. Arif leaned against a carved pillar, a ring heavy on each finger, hair oiled to a gloss. He was the kind of handsome that spoiled itself with entitlement. "You are late," he said, though she was not. He liked to say it anyway because it made him taller. "It is hot, Sahib," she murmured, and he smiled like a cat discovering a bird too frightened to fly. He didn't move to take the cup. He wanted her to step closer. She did, the tray steady in her hands. His gaze flicked over her face, down to her forearms dusted with flour, then to her throat where a burn scar from last year's oil splash drew a pale crescent. He had done that by knocking into her shoulder when she was ladling the biryani at her birthday party. Later, he laughed about it with his friends under drifting smoke from fireworks. He had said, "She's fireproof, watch." And she had learned a new definition of endurance. "Hold it there," he said softly. "I like the steam on my face." The steam curled up, obedient. Ilyana watched it blur his cheekbones. She could imagine a different steam, the one that would lift from soaked jute when flame met kerosene. The thought came quick and left a taste of tin on her tongue. "Run along," he added, finally taking the cup. "And tell your sisters to stop cackling like crows. Guests will arrive tomorrow for the New Year's. I don't want the yard smelling like laundry." She returned to the kitchen and exhaled into the silence that remained after certain men left. The silver clock clicked again. The onion skin rules fluttered as if some invisible hand was reminding her of air. She lifted a heavy pot, and grief ballooned through her arms, sudden and unsteady. When her mother died in June, the house had paused only long enough to rearrange the chores. Grief here had the same dignity as a broom. Gita came in wiping her hands on a clean cloth and gave Ilyana the look of a friend who knows your mind is on a ledge. "He asked for the chipped cup again?" "Yes." "You should hide it." "I did, last week. He found it." "He always finds what hurts." Gita's mouth tightened. "Minal's in the back, tying firecrackers into garlands for the children. I told her to be careful. The big ones are not the toy kind this year. Mr. Danyal brought them from Lahore. Illegal stuff that will blast off the neighbor's eyebrows if the neighbor breathes wrong." Ilyana looked up. "Show me." Gita hesitated. "If I show you, you will do a thing." "I will do the thing I must." They stood a moment at the kitchen's threshold, as if the door was an oath. Then Gita led her through the scullery to the back veranda, where the afternoon collected like copper coins. In the yard, under a string of faded prayer flags that no one prayed with, Minal sat cross-legged with a box of fireworks open like a surgical tray. Surya held twine with a solemn face, her mouth stained with pomegranate. "These are not for children," Ilyana said, crouching. She picked up one of the fat-sticked fireworks, its label a riot of color and English words that turned reckless inside a man's mouth. "Who plans the display?" "Arif," Surya said, then grimaced as if the name itself soured the tongue. "He said he will do it at midnight from the verandas around the ballroom." "And the ballroom?" "Already decorated. White cloth everywhere, paper stars. Roshni Madam wants it to look like snowfall, even though snowfall hasn't loved this valley for 3 dry winters." A wind snuck across the yard and lifted one of the paper stars. It looked weightless and muffled. The house liked to dress itself in illusions, but the bones of Harir House told the truth. Stone, wood, air pathways learned by smoke. Ilyana had kissed every draft with her cooking. She knew where heat rose fastest, which doorways gasped when you opened them, which corners collected grease no matter how often you scrubbed. She knew how to make a room warm for people who believed warmth was their inheritance. "Put the big ones aside," she said, voice even, "and do not tell anyone you moved them. Surya, bring me the ghee tins, the jute rope, the old metal basins we keep for soaking dal, and the lamp oil. There's a half a drum left from last winter." Gita's breath stuttered. "Ilyana!" "Yes." "You're doing a thing." "Yes." She considered her a heartbeat, then nodded. "I will help by not looking too closely." The plan did not arrive like thunder. It came like dough rising. Quietly, inevitable if you knew the warmth of the room. It had been swelling for months beyond grief, seeded by decades of inventory, of burns and slaps, of wages held back, of a mother's eyes turning toward a sudden absence of breath while the clock clicked, clicked, clicked. It took shape in the kitchen, where Shamsun had taught her that heat was a language, and where men who never listened to women nonetheless obeyed hunger at the hour women named. At first, the plan was just a thought Ilyana fed with her attention. New Year's Eve, fireworks to hide fire, paper snow to catch it, oil that would grab the cloth like a jealous hand, doors that could be wedged from the outside with a broom handle hacked into pegs, windows painted shut for aesthetics. The house's beautiful vanity was a conspiracy waiting to be recruited.
"Are we running?" Surya asked that evening as they shelled peas in the dim light. "If we run, I can take the photograph of Amma. I hid it under the rice sack." I brushed pea sweetness off my fingertips. "We will run after we stop what follows us." "What follows us?" "His reach." She didn't say Arif's name. She meant more than Arif. She meant the way the city never learned to see a girl like a person, how a household's patience could be a leash, how the word slave could be softened with laughter until it sounded like a nickname when it was really a weapon. She meant the debt that was written like a spell, whose ink refused to fade, a debt that had swallowed her mother's seasons and was choking theirs now. The next morning, December 29th, dawn sifted into the kitchen through the mesh-like flour, and with it came the intoxicating sound of possibility. Ilyana woke before the azan and sat on the floor with her back against the cool wall. She let her mind walk through the plan, step by step, until it no longer needed her hand. She pictured the ballroom draped in white cloth from the ceiling like veils, the paper stars trembling, the cut glass chandeliers like upside-down gardens shimmering with dust. She pictured the gala table with its mountain of fruit, the roast legs of lamb, the rows of silverware that thought good manners could disguise bad character. She pictured the men, how they would drink, the songs they would request of the musicians, the daring stories they would tell about breaking rules their fathers had written, the specific cruelty that came to Arif's mouth after midnight like a second language. "Walk me through the kitchen," she told Surya after breakfast, under the pretense of supervising the washing of pots. "Tell me everything the smoke tells you." Surya's eyes brightened as if someone had finally asked her the right question. She lifted the lid off the simmering broth and leaned her face into the steam, thoughtful as a priest. The smoke slides against the ceiling, pools above the door, hesitates at the shelf, and then it escapes from the gap near the window hinge. It escapes because we never fixed that hinge after the monsoon. If the door is closed, the smoke sighs before it leaves. And in the ballroom? Ballrooms do not have smoke. Tomorrow they will. That night, under the roof dust, the sisters slept side by side on the coir mat that made their backs ache but kept their bodies remembering one another's shape. Ilyana lay awake, hearing the house talk, 1,000 tiny conversations of wood and metal and wind. She wondered if there had been a moment when the house could have been a home before the rule sheet and the rings and the chipped cup. She knew better to ask the past for anything. It had nothing left to give. Morning arrived wearing a visitor's perfume. Trucks rattled up the drive with crates of fruit and crates of champagne and crates of illusion. Children from the neighboring houses trailed the vehicles like sparrows, their eyes greedy for confetti that might fall off the back. Begum Roshni stood in the doorway of the ballroom, supervising 2 workers who scrambled up ladders to secure the white cloth to the rafters. "Higher," she said. "It must look like clouds, not laundry." When her heel slipped on a fallen staple, she caught herself with a laugh that had too much shine. "Careful," she told no one in particular, and then to Ilyana, "Keep your sisters out of sight tomorrow until the plates need washing. They are too noisy." Ilyana bowed her head in a gesture that was almost prayer and not at all obedience. She took inventory, basins hidden under the sideboard in the servants' passage, ghee tins decanted into squat bottles that looked like water from a distance, lengths of jute rope coiled like sleeping serpents in the broom cupboard, broom handles sawed into pegs wrapped in old sari cloth to muffle the hammer taps. She had learned to move through the house as if she were a rumor, heard, denied, and feared. In the late afternoon, Daniel rolled in grinning from the city with a duffel bag full of explosives swelling with pride. "Imported," he announced to Arif, letting the word climb onto the furniture with its dirty boots. "You have never seen bursts like these. We'll make the sky gasp." "The sky has better taste," Gita said under her breath,
and Ilyana nearly laughed for the first time in a week. A boy named Basu, barely 10, with eyes too old for his face, slipped into the kitchen with a message clenched in his fist like contraband. From Chacha Kasim, he had been the groundskeeper since the house had more orchard than guests. He knew trees, and he knew grief. The message read in scrawled Urdu, "Tonight the wind comes from the east. Remember where it will push." She burned the scrap over the stove and felt the wind from the east kiss her cheek through the mesh. "Thank you," she told Basu, pressing a piece of jaggery into his hand. "For your mother," she added, because this was how love traveled safely in a house that distrusted it. By sunset, she could feel the city beginning to gather itself for the performance it loved best, pretending that turning a page on a calendar could turn a heart inside out. Music loosened in distant courtyards. Someone tested a loudspeaker that had only 2 moods, too quiet on the wrong word, too loud on the right one. The mountains above the city glowed with a color that broke her chest for a second. She wondered what it would be like to climb up there and look down on the world she could not flee and see it small. The thought was greedy and beautiful, and she folded it into her apron pocket like contraband, to take out later.
"Will fire make us monsters?" Surya asked, not as a child and not as a philosopher, but as a girl who had seen both. "Monsters are made by those who enjoy hurting," Ilyana said, checking the cloth-wrapped pegs again, fingers counting them the way her mother had counted spices. "What we are is a match that refuses to be wet." "We will be fugitives," Minal said, practical even as her voice trembled. "They will say we burned and ran. They will tell a version where we were wild and ungrateful. They will say we bit the hand that fed us." "Then let them keep their hands," Ilyana murmured. "We are done with chewing hope like gristle." The last day of the year arrived with a thin sun and too much ceremony. Harir House swelled with the sound of people who liked to hear themselves arrive. The driveway filled with cars sleek as fish, and the guard at the gate stood taller, as if proximity to wealth had lengthened his bones. Inside, the white-draped ballroom looked like a wedding dressed in denial. The chandeliers politicked with the mirrors. The mirrors lied with a talent that took practice. The paper stars hung everywhere like a threat to the darkness. Arif inspected the room and found one thing worth saying. "Perfect, except the smell." He turned to Ilyana. "Make sure the kitchen smells like cinnamon and not like effort." "Effort has a smell?" Gita whispered when he had gone. "Yes," Ilyana said, "and tonight it will smell like a door closing." They moved in choreography they had written with their lives. Ilyana arranged the feast with a precision that included deception. The lamb's glaze hid the glint of oil where it should not have been. The bowls of fried snacks, the platters of sugared dates, all ordinary to the eye. Minal disappeared into corners at intervals to check that the soaked jute ropes lay where they needed to lay. Coiled beside curtain hems, threaded behind the console under the center table, tucked against the arch where the east wind would lean. Surya, who House believed was careless, created a map without drawing one. She walked the perimeter, murmuring to herself about how smoke would travel if it were a girl given a chance to go to school. When evening slid into the room like a secret friend, the guests took their places. Their laughter polished itself in the mirrors. Their voices complicated the air. The string musicians in the corner played songs that were older than anyone's hope of justice. Begum Roshni wore a silk sari the color of a ripe bruise, rings stacked until her fingers looked like arguments. Daniel held court about foreign cities he had visited long enough to purchase a jacket. Arif moved through his own house like a man who believed the floor would never betray him. At 11:53, he announced, "Fireworks at midnight." The cheer was instant and obedient. He pointed at Ilyana. "Have sweets ready when the sky bows." He liked making the sky into a performer. Ilyana smiled exactly as much as required. "Yes, Sahib." With that, he lifted a bottle, and champagne corks began to pop like the knuckles of giants. Basu darted through the crowd with a tray down at his waist. Qasim, in the doorway, met Ilyana's gaze for a second, and the look traveled between them like a rope thrown across a river. He tilted his chin toward the east-facing arches. She breathed in, slow. "There is still time to change your mind," Gita whispered near her shoulder, the words a mercy and not a challenge. Ilyana's answer arrived as steady as boiling water. "I have already changed my life." She signaled to her sisters. They gathered by the servants' passage, a place that had a memory for their shadows. Minal's hands were steady. Surya's eyes were enormous with belief. "We will lock from the outside. Peg the doors here and here. The windows are painted shut. The north door has the warped frame. It will need both pegs. Remember the east wind. Remember you are not alone even when you are alone. When it begins, we go along the gallery and down the back stairs. We cross the yard. We climb the orchard wall. Qasim will leave the ladder like a rumor." "And then," Surya asked, because someone had to ask, "and then we keep moving until the smell of metal leaves our hair." Midnight arrived without tact. The musicians took a breath together. Outside, the first illegal flower burst above the veranda with a hiss that sounded like a warning and looked like a promise. Arif laughed, splitting the air. White petals of paper cloth trembled. For a second, the house held its own breath, waiting to be told whether to celebrate or to burn.
Ilyana moved. She slid along the wall and wedged the first peg through the loop she had screwed into the back of the ballroom door hinge with a stolen carpenter's tool days ago. Minal pegged the second hinge. Surya threaded the jute along the base of the room like a needle drawing a hem that would never be worn. Guests lifted their eyes to the sky, to the fireworks blooming and bruising above, and clapped at the shapes wealth made when it pretended to be joy. Begum Roshni turned once, distracted by a draft that did not belong in a room dressed for photographs. She frowned at the door hammered shut by etiquette. Danyal shouted for more bursts, more noise. The band, eager to please anyone who could pay, played louder. Ilyana knelt by the brass basin and lifted the cloth she had soaked and hid and blessed with rage. Kerosene smiled its thin, ugly smile. She looped the jute into the basin as if she were setting a table, as if she were not rewriting the history of her own bones. The scent rose like a prophecy. The east wind leaned in at the arches, curious as a child. Arif stepped toward the veranda with a Roman candle in his hand, about to light it and declare himself king of a sky that was bored of him. He glanced back at Ilyana, maybe to toss her a command or a cruelty. Their eyes met, and he saw something that made his mouth forget the words it liked. It wasn't hatred. It was a decision wearing calm like skin. For a heartbeat, the house was balanced on a knife. Somewhere a dog barked twice. Somewhere a glass went down on a table with less care than a life deserved. Somewhere Basu giggled because someone had tipped him too much. The fireworks paused between breaths. Ilyana struck the match. She watched the small flame begin its orange speech. She lowered it toward the soaked cloth with a hand that did not shake. She counted the way her mother had taught her to count time for bread to rise, and for the first time in her life, she realized that every recipe had been training for this exact moment. The match head touched the thread of jute. A bead of fire took hold, curious and hungry, and began to walk.
She lifted her face and felt the east wind slip a hand under the flame, as if to say, "I have been waiting to carry this for you." "Breathe," she told her sisters, and the word was both instruction and prayer, and the old forbidden daydream of air becoming theirs at last. Breathe, breathe, breathe. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. The wick drank the flame like a starving mouth, and the first coil of fire crept with the certainty of a decision finally spoken aloud. Ilyana's heartbeat steadied as the jute brightened to a thread of light. The east wind, true to Qasim's note, leaned in and lifted the newborn flame the way a midwife lifts a child to air. Suria's hand found the hem of Ilyana's kurta and clutched, not to stop her, not to beg her to turn back, but to remind them both that skin could be a rope when the world tried to unravel. Outside the arches, the sky burst with imported flowers. Inside the ballroom, the soaked hem of white cloth inhaled the heat with a sigh so small only a cook would hear it. The flame rode the jute into the cloth and became hunger. It moved with a quiet intelligence, finding the places in the fabric where oil had nested, kissing the edges of paper stars, tasting the starch in the drapery like sugar. Fire is a fast learner when the lesson is fuel. Nobody saw it at first. That was the genius of spectacle. It asked eyes to look upward and elsewhere. Arif, smiling toward the veranda, raised a Roman candle and shouted a countdown, every number a drumbeat for people who wanted to believe time was an obedient servant. 5. The crowd echoed him, drinks lifted. 4. The band swelled into a celebratory rag. 3. Daniel laughed over his shoulder and told a woman in sequins that he loved New Year's because it made men feel like gods. 2. The first hiss came from the corner where the white cloth grazed the floor behind the hydrangea arrangements. Ilyana watched the flame change shape as if it remembered itself. It climbed the drape in a long, silent line, and when it reached a ribbon fastened to the rafter, it paused, considered, and then split into delicate branches like veins spreading through skin. The paper snow was a field ready for drought. The drought arrived with teeth. Then the hem of the center drape caught, and the catching made a sound like a match, remembering it was once a tree. Flame ran up the fabric and unfurled across the ceiling in a wave. A chandelier trembled, all crystal, all pride. Wax tears slid. The musicians' bow hands faltered one beat and then continued, because men with wages to earn always continued until someone pulled them physically away from their tasks. Arif wheeled around, bright with irritation. He had not ordered this part. "Who?" he began. But the word "who" dissolved in heat as a ribbon of fire snapped and dropped like a live snake onto the buffet table. A napkin flared, obedient. Oil in one of the gilded lamps coughed and joined the lesson. "Door," Ilyana breathed. She and Manal drove the last peg through the hinge loop with the heel of a palm wrapped in cloth. The thud felt like punctuation. Surya laid the second jute thread along the skirting, each motion neat, unhurried. The illusion of unhurriedness is a boat you build for moments precisely like this. Begum Roshni's voice rose. What is that smell?" Her hand lifted to her nose, and the bangles on her wrist clanged like the panicked bells of a cow. She looked toward the painted shut windows and frowned, as if a servant had dared to shut the sky. The room tipped from denial to noise. Daniel swore. A guest near the arch teetered backward and knocked a tray from Basu's hands. Glasses shattered. Sugar syrup bled into the rug. The band stopped. As the violinist cried out, his sleeve had kissed a curtain and caught a bright kiss in return. He slapped at it, eyes white, and the smell of scorched hair wrote a new sentence in the air. Arif lunged at the nearest door and yanked. It did not yield. He yanked again and felt the peg answer from the other side like a bone refusing the pull from a joint. His face twisted. "Open it!" he screamed at the servants who must exist in every command he gave, even when there were none. "Open it!" Ilyana stepped backward into the servants' passage, heart a steady drum. Gita appeared at the corridor's bend, eyes like two flints struck together. The north door? Pegged. The veranda? Painted. The guard? In the courtyard. Qasim sent him with a jug of water to the old pump that does not work. Good. Gita's mouth trembled once and went thin. Go. I'll take Basu. Take yourself, Ilyana said, the plea shaking loose from the iron of her voice. Please. Cook, Gita said, and the word, weapon in other mouths, arrived in hers as a benediction. You're the one taking all of us. She vanished into the smoke like someone who knew where the floor remembered her weight. Inside the ballroom, the world became a map of will. The east wind shouldered its way under the arches and fed the ceiling cloth line by line. Fire walked like stitching. The white became orange, became black, and each change hummed like a word. Two men shoved a buffet table toward the door in a meaningless heroism. It scraped uselessly. A woman ran to the window, seized the sash, and rattled it against paint that had hardened for beauty's sake. The window did not remember how to be a window. She screamed. Arif reeled back from the door and seized the Roman candle again as if fireworks were a key for any lock. Move, he shouted at the crowd, at the smoke, at the betrayal of architecture. He pointed the candle at the hin seam as if light could burn through wood already learning a harder lesson. The candle spat sparks against the door and laughed, small, pretty, unhelpful, while real fire threaded itself along the balcony drapes and began to taste the rafters. His eyes found Ilyana in the passage shadows. In the thickening smoke, her face must have looked like a coin half in mud. Recognition snapped his teeth together. His mouth shaped her name and then refused to grant her that power. Cook, he roared. You open this door, you peasant, you... The words tumbled out of him like nails. She did not stop to collect them. Words rust, fire does not. Surya tugged at her sleeve. Now. Now, Ilyana agreed without speaking. They ran the narrow hall to the back stair that the house forgot to call grand. The steps creaked like conspirators, but held. Behind them, a sound developed. First, a low animal sound, then 100 sounds mating with panic. Glass popping, timber complaining, men shouting instructions that collided in the mouth and fell as nonsense. A child's high cry that should have been far away, but was here because rich people had brought their children to watch midnight like a trick. They reached the service landing. The air there was cooler, not by kindness but by design. Heat had not been invited to that part of the house when it was built. Qasim's ladder waited at the orchard wall beyond the back door, exactly as promised, laid down flat like a man asleep. The yard was a spill of stars, the eastern wind flicking the flame sound across stone. Minal lifted the ladder with her shoulder and set it to the wall in one motion as if she had always known how to. Surya climbed first because she would hesitate if she waited, and hesitation is a luxury fire taxes at a rate no one can pay. Ilyana followed. Her palms bit splinters. She threw herself across the top and landed in the orchard on the other side, knees.
Taking the bruise of new ground. Go, she said. The alley by the old shrine, then left, past the mechanic who sleeps with a wrench in his shirt. Then the lane with the goat that hates hats. Then... Footsteps thundered in the yard. The god had remembered there were other jobs besides fetching water from a dead pump. He burst into the back court, nightstick raised, eyes wide. "Stop!" he shouted into the dark. The word is useless as a stitched mouth. He saw the ladder's shadow and lunged. Qasim stepped from behind the neem tree like a story emerging from an old man's throat. He carried the axe he used for fallen Mems. He did not swing it. He simply set the handle between the god's ankles as the man rushed, and the god stumbled, cursed, tumbled hard onto his shoulder. The nightstick clattered away, rolling, deciding it had always wanted to be a spoon. Qasim looked up, and for 1 second Ilyana felt the strength of all the years balanced in his gaze. He didn't raise a hand, he raised his chin. "Go," the old man's face said, more command than every order Arif had ever given. She dropped into the orchard's dark and ran. The city's lanes took them like rivers take thieves, swallowing and shushing, spitting and pointing. They kept to the shadows of bikes, to the undersides of awnings,
to the places where dogs slept and learned not to bark at familiar poverty. Smoke chased them at a distance like a rumor that knew their names, but could not keep up with their feet. Their lungs burned with unlit fire. Their hearts tried to climb into their mouths and escape. At the shrine, a woman in a green shawl looked up from her prayer mat and blinked slow, as if she were watching sisters materialize from a folk tale. She did not ask questions. She pulled 3 thin glasses from the crate beside her, poured water that tasted of brass and mercy, and pressed them into shaking hands. "The alley is blind at the end," she murmured to the floor. "There's a loose board in the wall where the lemon tree grows. Through that, the lane is friendly." "Thank you," Ilyana said, and the words felt like they were made of skin. They slipped through the promise of the board, slid down the friendly lane, where a goat indeed slept on a pile of hats, and fetched up at last in the rear of a mechanic's yard where metal dreamed. Only then, with the house a red pulse behind the trees and voices beginning to rise like birds, did they stop. Ilyana leaned her head against a cold drum. Somewhere off to the right, the first siren began to keen, late and thin, grief trying to grow a spine. Surya vomited neatly into a rusted pan. Meenal rubbed her back and kept her own body still the way one keeps a pot from boiling over, by attending to it without allowing it to boss the stove. Ilyana's hands opened and closed against nothing. Her palms remembered the ladder, the pegs, the match. Her mind remembered her mother turning to the clock and saying, "Keep time, little one. If you do not keep time, time will keep you." "Are we bad?" Surya asked, the question a wooden bird pecking at the edge of her mouth. "We are finished with being prey," Ilyana said. The confession landed like bread on a plate. They tried to sleep an hour in that yard, while the city learned. The siren multiplied. Men shouted on the avenues about water and hoses and who was responsible for which corner of the burning map. A few voices talked of fireworks, always fireworks, and a few voices said the house had been so beautiful it should have learned not to catch fire. No one said the house had been cruel, and this is how some cruelty ends, swiftly, hotly, with the world pretending to be surprised. Before dawn, Kassan arrived with a limp that made the ground remember him. He ducked under the yard's loose tin and crouched so slowly the motion had time to become a blessing. "The guards will be at the front," he said. "The back lanes are busy with smoke, and old women with tears for people who never fed them. You can walk there, if you are neither stupid nor proud." "Gita?" Ilyana asked. "Gone," he said, and the word was a hand loosening around her throat. "She went with Basu. They know the gutter alleys like cats. They will not be found unless they wish to be. Here," he offered a bundle. "Cloth, bread, a little money, almost nothing in a world of numbers, but more than a man like him could keep without it being missed from his own life. There is also this." From inside his vest he drew out a small tin dented from years of being put down with care. He pressed it into Ilyana's palm. "She left it in my shed the day the Begum told her she could not carry anything from the kitchen that was not on a tray." Ilyana knew the tin before she saw it. Her mother's spice tin, the little one, not the big one. Inside would be the last pinch of her favorite mix, something she had ground on a rainy day long before her lungs forgot their alphabet. She did not open it. She held it like a small shoulder. "They will come for you," Kassan said softly, as if naming weather. "Some will come with law, and some with something they believe is better than law. You will not go to the bus station now, too obvious. You will not go to the river bridge. Everyone runs to bridges. You will go up." "Up?" Meenal asked.
"The terraces," he said, "through the quiet stairwells of people too poor to lock their roofs, over sleeping laundry, across the backs of kitchens, up to where morning begins without police. The mountain will take you as far as your breath allows. There is a tea house on the ridge that owes me for repairs on a broken hinge and a saved goat. Tell them the goat's name." "What is the goat's name?" Surya asked, as if the answer might include a lullaby. "Sabah." Kazim said, because she was born at dawn. Go now, and if you must give me to anyone to save yourselves, give them only my age and my limp. Those are already public truths. He made the sign that old men make when they believe in God enough to argue with him. The sisters slipped out of the yard, 3 shadows, trying to memorize their own shapes before the city assigned them new ones. They climbed, stair to stair, roof to roof, over wires that trembled with sparrows, past windows that held the evening inside like a secret. Once a woman on a terrace looked up from the sari she was beating against a stone and took in the sight of 3 girls with the fury of fire in their hair and did not ask why. She lifted a corner of the sari to make a bridge to the next parapet, a little flag that said, "This way," to those who could read it. At the 4th roof, a boy with a kite looked directly at Ileana and said, "They will say it was fireworks." He said it like a prayer. He said it like an alibi that wanted to be a story. "What will you say?" Ileana asked, not stopping. He grinned with a mouth missing 1 tooth. "I will say, the sky bit back." By noon, they reached the ridge, legs singing, lungs raw. The tea house was a wood and tin promise clinging to the mountain's shoulder. It leaned into the sky, as if sure the sky would catch it if it tipped too far. A woman with a braid fat as a cobra stood at the counter, counted their breaths like coins, and said, "What is the goat's name?" Surya answered, the syllables tender as if naming a sister. The woman poured tea darker than worry and slid a plate of bread across the wood. "My husband is suddenly a friend to hinges," she muttered, without warmth. "Sit in the back room. Do not touch the radio. Do not look out the window when a car stops. If anyone asks, you are my cousins from Bagh who cry too much and speak too little." Ileana ate with hands that knew they had earned this food harder than any feast she had ever cooked. Between bites, the radio in the front crackled with a voice too eager to be the first to tell disaster. "Authorities are investigating a late-night blaze at the Haria residence, believed to be caused by an accidental ignition of decorative materials during midnight fireworks. Multiple fatalities are confirmed, including—" The voice paused. Someone murmured. The voice returned with fresh polish. "Including prominent businessman Arif Harir and socialite Roshni Harir." Surya's cup clinked against the saucer. Minal's shoulders moved once as if something had flown into them. Ileana swallowed the taste that rose in her mouth and would not be named. Relief is a cousin of grief when you have had to become your own weapon. The radio went on. "There are rumors, unconfirmed, of sabotage by disgruntled staff. The cook, Samsun, a correction, the late cook, Samsun's daughters, names unknown, are being sought for questioning." Names unknown, Ileana thought, and the sentence was a door, terrible and vast, and opening. Names unknown. She touched the spice tin in her lap and felt her mother's hand lay itself over hers through metal and memory. She had an urge to set the tin on the threshold of some future room and say, "We brought our own seasoning. Make space." Afternoon folded itself into the corners of the tea house. Men came and went with dust on their boots and soot on their mouths. Lawyers in sleeves rolled to elbows argued about liability. A boy in a school sweater gestured with both hands as he described flames tall as his teacher. A woman with 2 babies tied to her chest shook her head and said, "Rich people die like poor people when breath decides it is nobody's servant." Toward evening, a police jeep groaned up the ridge road like a reluctant confession. The woman with the cobra braid did not look at the back room. She turned up the radio to drown the sound of the engine. But engines are proud. They don't like to be drowned. Boots on the porch. A voice like a chalkboard.
Open. The door opened. Chairs scraped. Ilyana breathed through her mouth because mouths do not betray secrets as easily as noses. She counted silently to anchor her hands to the table. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Time is a rope. Hold tight.
It is open, the chalkboard voice disagreed, which is why we are here. A pause. We are looking for 3 girls, one tall, the others younger. They smell like smoke. They were seen near the orchard wall. He said girls like he was mispronouncing a smaller word. I see many cousins, said the woman mildly. I smell only tea. A hand slapped wood. Cook's brats, the chalkboard voice said, enjoying the word too much. We find them, we will make them wish their mother had died sooner. Ilyana's knees struck the underside of the table before she could stop them. The tin jumped, made a small sound, like a spice jar, remembering it had a name. Silence. Then the slow creak of a step toward the back room. Minal's hand closed over Ilyana's, iron on iron. Not yet, her grip said. Not toward them. Not with your face like a banner. The door curtain trembled, lifted. A crash from the kitchen. The woman with the braid cursed loudly at an imaginary pot and shouted, "By God, the roof nails come down! Who will mend this if my husband falls and breaks his back? Take your police elsewhere unless you will hold the ladder yourselves." Men do not like ladders when the ladders belong to poor women. The chalkboard voice made a disgusted sound. The jeep sulked, and the mountain swallowed their going. The 3 sisters sat still until silence regained its confidence and stood fully upright in the room. Tonight, the woman said softly through the curtain, you do not sleep. You learn the mountain's path to the old quarry. You walk in the dark because the dark is kinder than men with paybooks. At the quarry lives a widow who has no patience for questions and likes her bread thin and her company thinner. She will keep you for 2 nights. After that, only God keeps people. We have made another arrangement with God, Ilyana said. It was not mockery. It was not prayer. It was simply geometry. 2 lines intersecting where someone had drawn them to meet. They walked. The mountain at night was a mouth speaking slowly. Stones announced themselves underfoot. The path stitched its way between thorn and thorn. Surya murmured, half to the sky and half to her feet. Left, right, left, breathe. The words becoming a drum simple enough to hold the beating of 3 lives. Twice they stopped for voices that were not wind or bird. Men half a hill away, smoking their nerves. Once they waited so long their calves trembled and a cough threatened to betray them. Minal pressed her thumb under Surya's tongue to stop it, a grandmother's trick inherited from someone else's grandmother and now useful as any weapon. At the quarry, the widow was smaller than the word widow. She was a person whose bones had decided to be angles more than curves. She led them to a shed that smelled of rain that had chosen not to leave, gave them blankets and watched with the flat care of a person who understood the mathematics of hiding. 1 day plus 1 day plus 1 day makes the days you can live. I never liked the Harirs, she said later, slicing onions into a pan without looking. They bought gravel like they bought people, cheap, late, and as if the gravel were doing them a favor by not becoming diamonds in their hands. In the shed, beneath blankets that knew other fugitive breaths, Ilyana did not sleep. She listened to her sister's lungs counting mercy. She rolled the spice tin in her palm and understood that the thing she had set on fire had been larger than Harir House. She had burned a word that had been used to crush her mother's name. She had burned a rule written by someone who had learned to write only to weaponize paper. She had burned a thing that seemed invincible because it had always worn a silk sari and a gold watch while killing. Morning approached in increments. With it came a kind of certainty that is not triumph, but the absence of despair. They ate onions and bread with tea, and the widow wrapped her shawl like a sentence around shoulders that did not want advice. She said, "There is a bus, but you will not take it. There is a truck with sacks of lentils. Ride under them if you want to live to see your own ankles from old age. Give the driver one of your bracelets and the story of a goat that returns when it is called." They climbed into a world of burlap and weight and milled dust. The sacks shifted like sleeping oxen. The driver, a man with kindness hidden under a weathered scowl, closed the back and banged twice on the panel in a rhythm that said, "You belong to this noise now." The truck coughed, found its lung, and rolled. Under the lentils, time was a different language. It took hours to say 5 minutes. It took a lifetime to turn onto the highway. The girls lay pressed together in a shape that would not let air be stingy. In the dark between sacks, Ilyana pictured the ballroom at the moment the chandelier let go. She saw Arif's mouth shaping orders as if commands could change physics. She saw Danielle sprinting for the veranda like a man who had never met the concept of painted shut. She did not linger in any of those faces. She had work to do in the dark. Keep breathing, keep counting, keep her sisters tethered to the rope of now.
At a checkpoint, the truck slowed. Voices looped around the vehicle like wire. A flashlight probed seams. Someone poked a crowbar into the lentils and met only the small, hard patience of legumes. A hand slapped canvas. A young policeman said, "We are looking for 3 girls." The driver's voice rolled out like old dough. "I have only grain," he said. "If the grain wears bangles, I cannot help it." Laughter. The crowbar withdrew, lonely, as if it had hoped to learn a name. When the truck finally exhaled them into a market town 2 districts away, sun was sitting high like a landlord. The driver lifted the flap and offered no smile, only a look that said, "I saw nothing worth seeing." He held out a hand, and Manal slid off a silver bangle. He put it in his pocket as if it were a receipt. The market smelled of turmeric and sweat and pencils being sharpened. It sounded like the throat of a people that refused to quiet even for grief. Ilyana guided her sisters down a lane of interlocking sounds until a poster nailed to a municipal board caught her breath by the jaw. 3 sketched faces looked out under a heading that had found a truth and dressed it for spectacle. Wanted for questioning. Arson at rear residence. The faces were poor drawings of girls who could be anyone. Underneath, in smaller letters, was a list of descriptors. Older in the eyes, the middle one with a scar ankle, the youngest with a singing voice, as if voice left fingerprints. "Scar ankle?" Surya whispered, lifting her hem instinctively. The small, pale line from a childhood fall hid obediently beneath her sock. "How do they know?" "They don't," Ilyana said. "Study replacing fear for a minute. This new problem wanting solving the way bread wants salt. They guess. They gather rumor like lentils and call it a meal." Her gaze fell to the bottom of the poster, where a reward amount fattened a man's greed as if greed needed feeding. Enough money to turn neighbors into moral accountants. "Names unknown," Manal read aloud, almost smiling. "We are ghosts with a budget." "We are daughters with a plan," Ilyana corrected gently. She turned from the board and led them into a narrow clinic where the doctor's sign promised injections without pain and reality handed out a compromise. The doctor looked at their faces and saw smoke in the eyes, which is a symptom in many illnesses. He gave them 3 masks. He gave them a strip of antibiotic cream for Surya's scraped knee. He told them about a train that left at dusk for a city that spoke in bigger lies. "If you board without tickets at the cattle siding, you are invisible unless you insist on being seen," he said, scratching an ear with his pen. They went to the siding when the day had used up its first set of hours. The train was a steel river too dignified to notice stowaways. But the men who guarded its banks noticed everything that might feed a family. Ilyana waited for a cluster of loud men to argue about a crate of mangoes and slid them beneath a carriage with the smoothness of practiced grace. Under the belly of the beast, oil dripped and iron sighed. The world of mechanical patience held them while the sun took off its necklace. When the train moved, the sound chose their bones and shook them awake from the idea that they were safe. The city at the other end was not safer, only different.
It had a smell that pretended to be opportunity and a shape that pretended to be choice. They climbed out between cars and found themselves in a yard where dogs had written law in the dust and men had overruled it with boot prints. Above them, billboards taught a lesson about whitened skin and widened eyes. Below them, a woman with a basket on her head taught a different lesson with the way she walked. Stay in your own shadow. It will not betray you. They worked. It is both a long story and not one fit for telling, the way three girls worked their way through a city that did not want them unless it could sell them. They washed dishes in a stall that treated water like treasure. They stitched buttons for a tailor too tired to be cruel. They cleaned an office at midnight and listened to a security guard try to teach himself English by repeating radio jingles. They slept in rooms that had been promised to others and paid rent with hours shaved from their bones. They did not become saints. They did not become criminals beyond what they had already confessed to fire. They became something harder and less photogenic. Survivors who planned for the day after tomorrow while walking through the mouth of today.
Sometimes the Harir fire walked into the room without knocking. A newspaper left on a chai stall would open to a column about investigations delayed by paperwork. A television in a shop window would spit grainy footage of a chandelier falling like a beheading in a foreign film. Men would argue about whether the cook's daughters had burned the house or whether the house had burned itself because it was tired of language. One night, standing in a doorway to let the rain pass, Ilyana heard a man tell another someone said the cook girl looked at the master as if he were furniture. And the other man laughed and said, "That is what kills men like that, not fire, the moment a woman decides he is an object in a room she knows better than he does." Months scraped past like music through a bad speaker. In her pocket, the spice tin became lighter simply because her hand had grown used to its weight. In their bodies, fear rewired itself into something that woke them early and made them count exit doors in every space. In their mouths, silence learned to sit without becoming bitterness. They were not hunted every minute, but they were never done with being careful. And then, because time has a sense of humor that sometimes looks like grace, they were seen by a person who did not call the number on the poster. It happened in a narrow market where women bought hair oil that promised new husbands and coriander that promised old flavors. An elderly woman with a laughter line like a scene between continents squinted at Ilyana and said, "Shamsun's child." Ilyana froze and measured the distance between herself and every decision she had made. The woman's eyes flooded with an old salt. "She once traded me extra cardamom when my son was hungry. I never forgot the taste of generosity." She pressed 3 rupees into Ilyana's hand, the coin heavier than any reward. "Eat something sweet for her soul," she said, and moved on before gratitude could turn dangerous. On a day that looked like any other, until it wasn't. A letter found them. Letters are like dogs. They so often find the people who need them when men haven't bothered to train them. It was not addressed by name because names are wind in the wrong years. It was addressed to the girls who say time out loud. Inside, 3 lines, written in a hand that made the paper look braver. "The investigation closes tomorrow for lack of evidence. The file will sleep. Sleep is a kind of death that does not require a funeral. The city will spend its worry elsewhere. Q." There was more on the back. "Your mother's grave has a new stone. The old one cracked under heat long ago. Come if you dare, or remember if you don't." They went. Not by bus, not by train, by a series of feet and shared space and a borrowed handcart that pretended to be a plan. They timed their travel like thieves who had learned to wear the day as if it were night. They entered the old neighborhood at dusk, shaped like people with errands. The cemetery wore the evening like a shawl. The caretaker nodded at them as if women came every hour with palms alive with memory. Maybe they did. Maybe the world was less lonely than fear suggested. Shamsun's grave did not need the stone to announce itself. It pulled at Ilyana's tendons from the gate. Still, the stone mattered. It was plain, its letters arguing with modesty, saying her name with a firmness that had not been allowed in the kitchen. Shamsun bint Rahim, mother, cook, woman who kept time. Someone, Qasim surely, had included a line in Urdu that had been a lullaby once. Sleep, little flame, morning will borrow you again. Ilyana knelt. The ground was the same ground that had borne her weight the day she had become a word she did not choose. It bore her now, as if forgiving were not just for people. She opened the spice tin at last. The scent rose, not of death, but of coriander, of cumin, of a little cinnamon that had always been too expensive and always found its way into poor people's sweets when they wanted to believe in celebration. She tipped the last dust onto the soil and smoothed it with her fingers. We cooked the end. We cook beginnings now. Behind her, footsteps. She turned, heart loaded. In the path stood a man with a great cap pulled low, a newspaper folded in his fist like a verdict. He looked at the sisters for a long time the way men look at mountains when they remember they are small. Then he said, "The reward is enough to feed my children for a year." He did not move toward them. He did not move away. But I had a sister. She worked in a house where no one learned her name. When she died, they gave my mother a kilogram of sugar. "A kilogram of sugar," he repeated, his mouth trailing the words like a broken sandal. He lifted the newspaper. I read this and thought of the taste of grief. It is too sweet. No one spoke. The cemetery's birds arranged themselves higher in the tree, listening for whether men would be useful or not. At last, the man raised his chin. "Go," he said. "I do not want to teach my children that money is God." He spat to the side, not at them, not at the dead, but at a world that made spitting the only weapon he could afford. He turned away, shoulders bargaining with the sky. The sisters exhaled the breath they had been storing since the fire, the breath they had pretended to spend but had kept hidden for luck. They left the cemetery by the alley that mothers use when they visit graves and need the world not to see their red eyes. They did not look back because looking back is a luxury when forward is not yet guaranteed. Night gathered and decided to be kind. On the edge of the city, in a bus yard where engines dreamed of tomorrow, the sisters found a driver who spoke like a well. He listened to Ilyana say, "We need the road that goes near the salt lakes." And he nodded as if salt had always been an ally to people who knew about preserving things they loved. "Seats?" he asked. "Standing," Ilyana said. "Standing is honest." They climbed aboard. The bus coughed, wheezed, and declared itself ready. Behind them, the city arranged its neon badge. Ahead, the road braided itself with the dark. In her pocket, the spice tin lay empty and necessary. On her tongue, Ilyana kept a grain of cinnamon the way some people keep scripture. Half an hour outside the city limits, the bus slowed. A checkpoint. 2 men with torches and ledgers. The driver sucked his teeth and muttered something about taxes. Ledgers have hungry mouths. They like to put names into columns and swallow them. A torch rose, fell. A voice asked for proof that everyone aboard was the person their face promised to be. The bus sighed as if tired of being an ark. Ilyana felt Sharia's hand slide into hers and Minal's forearm press into her side in a gesture that said, "Trust the rope." The torch neared, throwing light onto faces that had learned how to be dull. It was close enough now that it would reveal the shape of a scar on an ankle if it looked down. It was close enough to taste their breath and say, "Fire." The beam lifted toward their row and stopped on the driver's clipboard as one of the men argued about a signature smudged by oil. The other laughed and touched his torch to a moth that had fallen in love with light. The bus shuddered, insulted by delay. "Keep your names," the driver murmured without turning. "They are yours, not theirs." The beam moved on. The ledger snapped shut. the rope of now held. As the bus eased forward into the night's long mouth, Aliana leaned her head against the window and watched the dark slide by, a procession of rooms where other people were learning to keep time. She thought of what they had burned and what refused to burn. She thought of the mountain and the boy with the kite and the woman with the braid and Qasim's slow hands and the feel of the match at the precise second a life changes. "I'm going to learn to build stoves," she said suddenly, to no one and to both of them. "Ones that eat less wood, ones that don't smoke us like meat. I'm going to make a kitchen where the rules make food and not cages." Surya pressed her forehead to the window, and "I'll plant a lemon tree that puts its board exactly where girls need it." Minal chuckled, the sound finally thawing into warmth. "I'll design doors that open from the inside, even when men paint them shut." In the seat ahead, a child turned and stared at them with the solemn curiosity of humans who have not yet learned to pretend. He said, "Where are you going?" Aliana answered, "Forward." The bus picked up speed and the road unrolled itself as if relieved to finally be trusted. In the far distance, lightning stitched the sky without rain, an old tailor's trick to keep clouds from falling apart. The sisters did not sleep. They counted the small thuds of the tires over seams, and with each thud, Aliana felt the weight of the poster, the house, the word slave loosened another knot in the long rope of her life. Then the bus slowed again, too soon, too sudden. The driver cursed softly, pulled to the shoulder. Ahead, flashing lights made a carnival out of authority. A figure stepped into the road in a gray cap, newspaper under his arm, hand raised. The driver leaned out. A brief exchange, the head figure turned not toward the bus in general, but toward their window exactly as if memory had eyes. Aliana's ribs tightened. The gray cap lifted a fraction, just enough for her to recognize a jawline that had learned mercy the hard way. The man from the cemetery stepped back and waved them on. The bus lurched forward, the night reopened. Aliana let out a sound that was not a laugh and not a sob, but something that people who haven't invented a word for it still recognize. She pressed her palm to the glass until her hand learned it could pass through nothing and still keep moving. Ahead, the salt lakes would arrive at dawn and lay out a flat prophecy of white. Beyond them, new names waited on a shelf. Maybe a room with a stove that saved breath. Maybe a workshop where doors learned a better language. Maybe a life that did not explain itself to men with ledgers and torches. But that was morning's work. For now, the road, the breath, the rope of time in their hands, and three sisters who had burned a house so that a set of rules wouldn't burn them first.